Hey everybody, today I am here with Jonathan Taplin, whose work I encountered recently, reading his fantastic book, The End of Reality, which covers a lot of the same themes that I've been writing about recently, about the sort of tech billionaire boy club and the impact they're having on society. But Jonathan, I know you've had a very long and storied career and done all this incredible work in so many fields. I think it's best if I let you just introduce yourself for a minute, because I think you'll do a better job than I will.
Sure. So I got started in the media business in 1965 when I went to the Newport Folk Festival as just before my freshman year at Princeton and got introduced to Albert Grossman, who was Bob Dylan's manager, and eventually to Bob Dylan. And I started working for Albert Grossman as a road manager for various groups while I was at Princeton on weekends. The Jim Kweskin Jug Band, Janis Joplin, and eventually I became the tour manager for the band, then Bob Dylan and the band in the late 60s, early 70s. And then I produced the concert for Bangladesh for George Harrison. Then went out to Hollywood because a lot of the musicians I wanted to work with didn't want to go on the road anymore. And met a young filmmaker named Martin Scorsese, who was a film editor at the time, and kind of didn't know enough not to put my own money into making a movie. So we made a movie called Mean Streets, which fortunately turned out to be a very good movie. And then
Great film. I love that. I love that film.
we sold it to Warner Brothers, and then I was a movie producer, and I produced The Last Waltz with Marty. I produced Under Fire with Nick Nolte and Gene Hackman. I produced To Die For, a lot of movies, a lot of documentaries. And then in 1984, I was a producer at Walt Disney when a guy named Saul Steinberg started a corporate raid on Walt Disney. And I got some friends of mine in Texas, the Bass brothers, to save the mouse, as we put it. So we made a deal for the Basses to sell their real estate empire in Orlando to Disney for stock and put enough stock in friendly hands to block Steinberg. And so, the Basses paid me a lot of money for that. And since I made more money in 3 weeks than I'd made in 5 years, they said, we'd like you to go to work for our investment banker, which was Merrill Lynch Mergers and Acquisition Group. And so I did that, which was a kind of strange transition. But it was fun for a while, and then it was not fun. It
The,
was
the, the Basses were originally oil money. Is that correct or no?
they were oil money. But they had expanded radically into investing in a lot of big companies. Um, and then, near the end of the 80s, there was too much of Mike Milken and Ivan Boesky and a lot of sleazebags. And I just didn't like the vibe. And so I went back to making movies with a guy named Wim Wenders, and we made a movie called Until the End of the World.
I've
And
seen that film many
it
years ago.
took us all around the world for 2 years. It was like joining the French Foreign Legion. And then I started producing long form documentaries for PBS, one called The Prize on the history of the oil business, and another one called Cadillac Desert on history of water in the West. And then in um, the mid 90s, I had a movie called Shine, which I took to Sundance to sell. And I sold it to a company called Fine Line. And Harvey Weinstein, who had had the opportunity to buy it before Sundance and had passed, all of a sudden realized that he'd missed a good thing, and he, famously confronted me and tried to strangle me in a restaurant in Sundance. And he was a big bully, and so that was a very famous blow up. And then in the late 90s, I started a company called Entertainer, which was the first video on demand company, streaming video on demand company. And Entertainer was getting very successful in the early 2000s, but the major studios decided they didn't want another intermediary between them and the customer, and they started their own version of Entertainer and stopped licensing us movies. Just literally in a week, we went from having 8,000 movies on the service to having 8 movies on the service. So I shut it down, sued them all in federal antitrust court. And since I was suing all the major studios, I couldn't go back to being a movie producer. So the dean of the Annenberg School at University of Southern California asked me if I wanted to come teach. And I thought, why not? So eventually I won the antitrust suit so I could afford to teach. And I taught at USC for almost 15 years, and started writing books in 2015 about big tech and how it was, as my first book was called, Move Fast and Break Things, how Amazon, Facebook, and Google cornered culture and undermined democracy. And to give you an idea of how strange an idea that was in 2015, the English publisher asked that we take the, undermine democracy out of the subtitle.
Right.
And I refused. And then, I just continued to write books. I retired from USC in 2018. And, I wrote a memoir called The Magic Years. And then I wrote End of Reality. And now I'm writing another book.
Cool.
So that brings us up
let's
to the present.
Yeah, well, let's talk about this. The technocratic, the tech bro elite and the disruption of democracy and the end of reality a little bit.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, the book covers a lot of ground. Actually, you talk about the history of libertarianism, kind of the history of propaganda and the media in the U.S. And I guess for you coming from kind of this entertainment music world, perhaps an entry point for you was like Spotify and YouTube and the way that kind of creative artists began to be kind of like ripped off, let's say, by the monopoly power of these companies and so on. So maybe just tell us a little about your critique.
Yeah.
Where you
Well,
are now.
it really, Move Fast and Break Things started from a very personal story, which was that Levon Helm, who was the drummer and singer in the band, was, even though the band stopped recording in 76, was still making a fairly decent living off of the recordings, because in the late 80s, the CD was introduced. And so everybody who had a vinyl record collection completely renewed their collection on CDs. So the royalties that flowed to musicians, and since the band's records were all classics, were great. I mean, he was making 150,000 a year from royalties, record royalties, up to 99. And then, you have this very strange thing where all of a sudden people want to put music online for free. And that just completely stopped the royalty payments to Levon. And Levon had throat cancer in 91, and so he couldn't perform. And, he didn't even have enough money to pay for his cancer care. And so that was just made me crazy. And
Yeah.
so I I started writing about that. And of course, YouTube at that point was given what is called safe harbor, which was one of the great mistakes of the Clinton
Yeah.
Gore.
This is a Proposition 230 in the 1996
Yeah,
telecommunications.
Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically says that an online service, a social media service like YouTube or Facebook or X or whatever, is not a publisher, but is a platform.
Right.
And so they cannot be sued for anything that is on their platform. Now, the idea that X is not a publisher is such a bizarre idea. I mean, Elon Musk is as much a publisher as Rupert Murdoch is. He skews the algorithm in such a way that his posts get to everybody. Unless you actively block Elon Musk, you have to see everything he says.
I have a question for you. I mean, retrospectively, that Section 230, the safe harbor clause, turns out to have been so immensely important. What was the background? Like because 96, these tech, giants weren't as gigantic as they are now. What was the machinations that led that to
Well,
be
the idea was that internet is, and this is a lot of it's Al Gore. I must tell you, Al Gore and a senator from Oregon named Ron Wyden, and they thought this technology is so delicate and so new and so democratic that we have to give it special protection, what they called the liability shield. Now, Johnson and Johnson doesn't have a liability shield. If
yeah,
Tylenol is poisonous, you can sue Johnson and Johnson. So
yeah.
this was just like a special deal for a very small number of companies. And of course, it became the way that they built their monopoly because they never have to worry about anything that was on their service. Um, the the users provided all the content, so you didn't have to pay for content.
Yeah.
And they took all the advertising money and maybe under the force of a gun began in, the late 2009, 2010, YouTube began to give the record companies a little bit of the advertising that was attached to their content. But it still didn't prevent anybody from putting up any song on YouTube that they wanted,
Yeah.
whether copyright or not. And of course, for musicians, that was a disaster.
Yeah. So you had this kind of personal, like access where you saw the destructive impacts of this stuff, and then you sort of went on to inquire into the whole ideology behind it. I noticed you talked about John Perry Barlow, who I knew a bit from the whole Burning Man world, and this sort of yeah, like so how did this like how did technology and libertarianism come together?
Well, look, a lot of these people were huge Ayn Rand fans. I mean, if you ask Peter Thiel or Elon Musk or Mark Andreessen or Mark Zuckerberg, they will all tell you they read The Fountainhead and they read all of Ayn Rand's stuff. So it was kind of baked into Silicon Valley from the beginning.
It's so funny. She's one of those writers where I just literally cannot read her. Like I read like a paragraph and I feel like my brain is going to fall out of my ears or something. It's something about the language, and I just
I feel the same way. I just don't get it. And yet I hear people, I mean, Donald Trump tells you that Ayn Rand is the greatest author in the world.
yeah.
And it's probably because one of his characters is a builder, right? And so Trump imagines himself to be that character. But
Well,
look,
yeah, it's the idea that unbridled self-interest and collective interest are ultimately the same thing.
yeah, I mean, she basically says there is no such thing as altruism.
Yeah.
Altruism is a poison, and you have to forget about it.
Yeah.
So
And that's something like Curtis Yarvin, who I just spoke with, he's espoused the same idea that, oh, any compassion or any altruism on the part of liberals is just like a fraud. It's like this whole idea that human nature is ultimately egocentric and greed-based, and anything
right,
else is actually just a shield or like a sort of a Nietzschean kind of like will to power, kind of like a subversive way to express that same thing in a way.
exactly. It's like the people who took Darwin and said the world is about the survival of the fittest.
Yeah,
And then E.O. Wilson comes along and says, well, that's not actually true.
yeah,
He said, it, in the early caveman days, somebody had to stay behind and tend the fire. Because if the fire went out, it was disaster. So
yeah.
some guys could go off and hunt for food, but other people had to stay, protect the women, you know,
Totally.
to the
Well, the
fire.
whole idea that it's a
You know,
dog eat dog world, and yet dogs actually don't eat other dogs.
yeah, and the
You
world is
like
actually,
yeah, that actually people work together, and even different organisms work together often.
yeah, and the successful tribes were the ones who were the most cooperative.
Yeah,
You know, Margaret Mead has a famous moment in her teaching career when she was questioned by a young man in her class, in her anthropology class, of what was the first sign of civilization that she encountered in her anthropology work. And he expected her to say some clay pot, which meant that people were cooking things or something. And and she showed the picture of a broken femur, lower leg bone, that had repaired itself. And from a very early caveman. And she said, okay, if you broke your leg in that world, you were dead because the animals would come and get you. You couldn't run away from the animals. And so what had happened here? She surmised that someone had lifted this, or a couple of people had lifted this guy up. It was a man's leg bone, and carried him to the village. Someone had been with him and tended for him and made sure he healed and fed him and got him water and did all the things that helped him survive. And eventually the bone healed. And that was civilization. That cooperative, helping each other thing was what made the difference. But these guys don't believe that. Peter Thiel doesn't believe that for a second, you know.
yeah. I mean, in the end of reality, kind of you talk about kind of the more idealistic kind of ideas in earlier technology, whether it's like Steve Jobs or Stuart Brand. This idea that internets were going to be the internet or the networks were going to be kind of innately democratizing,
Yeah.
innately cooperative technologies. And yeah, now we've seen it's gone in a totally different direction.
Well,
So what happened there?
so, the early guys that were inventing the internet, and Vint Cerf is one of them that I've spent time with, um, they really thought it was going to democratize communications completely. And their notion, of course, you and I are both old enough to remember when there were three TV networks. It was a monopoly of communications on terms of television news and stuff like that. So they were very optimistic about this. But what happened was that they gave all their protocols, TCP/IP, HTML, all those things, they donated them for free to make this thing happen. And of course, it was all organized by the Army, by DARPA,
Yeah,
the Defense Advanced Research Project Administration. And the reason to build it was, of course, we were afraid that the Soviets would launch a nuclear missile to Dallas, and if Dallas went down, the whole phone network would go down, everything would go down. So you wanted to build this self-repairing network that would stay up no matter in the middle of a nuclear war. So what happens, of course, is that within 10 years, Google, Meta, whatever, 3 or 4 corporations end up completely monopolizing the business part of the internet. Google has 90% market share, as the recent antitrust trial proved. Who's ever heard of a situation where someone has 90% market share that isn't called a monopoly? But for some reason, it was always, and I call it techno-determinism, was always that, well, we, the politicians, don't really know much about this complicated thing, and we're going to just kind of leave it to the people who are building it to tell us what should happen. So if you think about the introduction of social media, we could have told by 2011, that it was being a destructive force. You could see the hockey stick of teenage suicide. Soon as the like button is introduced to Facebook, it just takes off. Same with Instagram, all of that. So we could have done something about it, but the notion was always, well, these politicians don't know anything, so why should we let them anywhere near it? And of course, quite frankly, Zuckerberg would come to Congress and some yob would say, well, how do you make any money off this? Some senator, from Nevada, and it was like they were clueless. So the general thing was leave them alone. And
I read a book called Internet for the People by this guy, Ben Mesrich, a very nice book. But he was talking about how crazy that essentially the government just gave away the internet to these corporations. Like we spend public money to build it. And actually all these are these libertarians who, believe that they shouldn't be taxed. The basis of their wealth is a public good and a public trust that they were just handed over without any quid pro quo or any kind of oversight or anything.
But now we're into something brand new, in the sense that the oligarchs, in the classic sense that we talk about them in Russia or thing, are inside the tent. They're in the White House. And Elon, I believe, has so much influence that they're going to basically get to do what they want to do. I mean, if you think about this Doge thing that he's going to run, the Department of, Efficiency, is it's such a scam. I mean, who could have thought of that? It's a classic kleptocrat scam. And so he's going to go in and say, well, Lockheed and Boeing are really inefficient the way they're building the missiles for the government. And let's get rid of them. And who's left? Him and Jeff Bezos, right? Essentially you're privatizing everything and you're getting rid of competitors.
I completely agree with you, but I also want to just look at it a little bit of devil's advocate way, because I think it's always good to think about that. It is the case that, I think when Musk took over Twitter, there were like 8,000 employees. I think he cut it like 80%, and it's still, then he also futzed with the algorithms, but it seems like it does still kind of work exactly as it did before. So there probably is, the military budget is what, $850 billion a year. There probably are like highly bloated, bureaucracies, people taking huge amounts of pork. And, there would be an argument for shimmying that down. And it wasn't going to happen under the Democrats. So, sometimes I think there could be a little bit of an argument that like we'd hit a structural impasse, and the Democrats were stuck. They killed off Bernie Sanders when he could have rescued the party from oblivion, and so we put ourselves in a situation where structural change is needed. Everybody is incredibly frustrated, and as awful as this is going to be, and it's so much in the wrong direction, and probably cause so much pain and suffering, and all sorts of stuff. I mean, maybe this is the only way to break down, to break through. I don't know, but I could see an argument there.
Look, Daniel, I agree with you 100%. I think the Pentagon budget is absurd. Because I write about big tech and its dangers, it's something that's fascinating to people all over the world. So I travel around and give speeches, right? And whether it's in Asia or Europe, I go through these brand new, beautiful airports and get on a 300-mile-an-hour train to some place, and I pass by giant wind farms or solar farms, and I think to myself, why is it all these countries, whether it's in Asia or Europe, that are much poorer than us, have a much higher level of infrastructure that's actually modern? And there's one very simple solution. None of them spend 51% of their discretionary budget on the military.
Yeah, well, there's two things. There's that, but then there's also, the taxing of the wealthy, right? Like when America was the Great Society in the 50s and so on, the tax rate on the highest earners was over 90%, over $200,000 a year. So that money was going into social services. That's why public education got good. That's why public health was decent. And then they dismantled that, from Reagan on, maybe even earlier.
Yeah, but look, I'm writing a new book, and part of the thesis of it is that we need to go back to a much more Jeffersonian view of how America works. In other words, if the Trumpists are going to control Washington, then there is no reason that California has to have its ban on assault weapons overruled by Washington. There's no reason why New York or Vermont has to tell women how, their reproductive freedom is going through. There's no reason that California has to reduce its auto emissions law. In other words, what we need is a kind of live and let live society in which, and it's called federalism. And Jefferson designed it that way. He said the states are independent, there's everything internal to themselves, and they're united with the federal government facing out to other countries. So in his day, when he was president, there was a Secretary of the Treasury, a Secretary of War, and a Secretary of State, and an Attorney General. And that was the entire cabinet. And everything else was done at the state level. And so on a certain level, I'm happy if these guys want to go in and just, root and branch, get rid of all these things and leave it to the states. That would mean a very different taxing structure because, needless to say, is the blue states completely subsidize the red states. California, for every dollar it puts in taxes, it gets back 70 cents. And Mississippi, for every dollar in taxes it puts in, it gets back $1.30. So that's just the way it's been for a long, long time. And so I'm feeling in the face of this kind of Trumpist world that we need to go back to a much earlier view. I mean, I call it new federalism, and I think that's what has to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I guess within the people who've just taken over the national government or about to take over the national government, there's also different, tendencies, right? There's a libertarian crowd like Teal although Thiel is kind of like you could say, somewhere between a authoritarian neo-fascist and a libertarian. A lot
Right.
of those guys are, right? Like they're happy to work with the federal government when it benefits them, and then to pretend that they, don't like it. But you have these guys who, in theory anyway, would be all for federalism, but then you have the Christian right who are just simply wanting to control the population, right? So you have like different factors.
And they want to tell everybody what to do.
Yeah,
You talk about a nanny state, that's what they want. They
yeah.
want to tell everyone what to do, the Christian right is.
Or
And
like
quite
it's
frankly,
a
I
very
think
evil stepfather state.
The Christian right has a lot of power.
Yeah.
I mean, J.D. Vance is straight out of that playbook.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, well, I want to talk about crypto a little bit, and Bitcoin and your perspective on that. I mean, yeah, I mean, it feels like, now that this has happened, there feels like a little bit of inevitability, or like that somehow things were gonna, reach this culmination, like, the same way you might have thought of Nazism, once it happened, or communism as having a certain kind of inevitability. Like there were a lot of things pushing. I mean, what one major issue, which on the New Republic I thought just had a very excellent piece, that the major reason that Trump won was right-wing media, and that sort of the established and progressive media world really didn't, or the backers of that world, so they didn't really realize how quickly right-wing media was growing. And whereas, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, like establishment media like the New York Times and ABC was like a basketball, and right-wing media like Breitbart and Fox was like a golf ball. As time has passed, all these right-wing media outlets have grown bigger and bigger, so they've become like a volleyball, and establishment liberal, progressive, whatever you want to call it, or just neutral media has become more like a tennis ball. So they've actually their reach has outgrown. And so if we were to try to like take back the US from what's happened, it seems like there would need to be a new kind of media approach, or media infrastructure. What do you think about that?
Well, here's the deal. I've been saying this for quite a while. So Elon Musk has 200 million followers on Twitter. And near the end of the election season, every one of them was getting 5 to 12 tweets a day from Elon. And he had got his engineers to fix the algorithm such a way that everyone saw every tweet.
Yeah.
In other words, you may have, you know, 300 people that you follow on Twitter, but you don't see everything from every one of those 300 people
No,
every
clearly
day.
it was clearly he
So
fixed
he
the algorithm.
tweaked the algorithm.
Yeah.
So the New York Times has 10 million digital subscribers,
Yeah.
right? Who once a day probably look at their paper and maybe might look at the opinion section, which, by the way, has quite a few conservative opinion writers too. So the diet people were getting from Elon's propaganda feed was just unrelenting.
Yeah.
And so there's no comparison.
Well, I mean,
And
there is kind of a worship of wealth in this country, right? And he's the richest man. So for many people, that just means he's like God or something like that. Did you see that the thing where Elon Musk is suing the state of California because they set up they put a state law where you couldn't use deep fakes to influence elections, and he's saying that interferes with First Amendment rights. I mean, that's another whole thing. The weaponization of free speech is a very powerful thing here.
yeah,
You know?
I mean, I my sense is that some of this is almost unstoppable on a national level. In other words, uh, and that's why I'm saying, look, I live in California. I don't have to have this affect my life. I'm very happy that California has banned assault weapons. I'm very happy that California has a very strict auto emissions law. I'm very happy that California gives women the freedom to do whatever they want with their bodies. And as long as that is not affected by the national government, then, you know, they're going to go do what they're going to do. And who knows whether it'll turn out to be a total disaster or not. I mean, there's a lot of discussion to be had of whether tariffs is the solution to all the problems like Trump says it was. Because, there were people in 1931 who thought that was true, and they passed Smoot-Hawley, and it turned out to be deepen the recession by 5 to 7 years.
Yeah.
Great Depression. So
I have to say, I'm not as optimistic about this Jeffersonian idea of the states turning inward. I just think that I mean, yeah, there's just too many forces at play that I think it would be more that we would have to try to build an alternative media infrastructure if we cared to try to move things in a different direction.
But since when has truth had any purchase in the last 5 years? I mean, that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
Truth is evanescent. And
This could make a comeback. You never know.
well, I mean, it clearly, Elon could post that the Haitians were eating the cats and dogs multiple times, and nobody called him on it.
Yeah. So let's look over. I mean, yeah. I mean, I guess one possibility is that these guys are going to overreach in various respects.
Yeah.
And one area of potential overreach, could be crypto. And I think you talked a little bit about Bitcoin in the book. I don't know, what your feeling about Bitcoin is. I mean, now I think it's like $99,000 per Bitcoin. But there is, the actual reality of what Bitcoin, is made of is still very flimsy, right? It's basically a social agreement. It's a mathematical code. How do you look at this? I mean, do you think that the crypto inflation could be something like a subprime mortgage kind of because it's also a situation where I think only 2% of Bitcoin holders own like 98% of the Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So it's sort of wealth distribution.
It's totally a bubble.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen is, the people that in the crypto world are called the whales. So these are the people, it's a classic 80-20 situation that 80% of the wealth is held by 20% of the holders.
Yeah, it's even worse than that. It's much worse.
Yeah, and it was much more severe than that.
Yeah.
The last time the whales dumped all their currency. You recall in the winter of 2021 when all the exchanges started advertising and you had Matt Damon and Larry David and Ron and everybody, Tom Brady out there pitching. And of course, the Andreessens of the world were dumping their coins at that point it was 65,000, and by the spring it was down to 20,000. So these bubbles come and go, and right now the reason people are in is Trump says he's all in for crypto, and so they think there's going to be some kind of magical thing happen. Crypto is not built for any use. At least with gold, you can melt it down and make jewelry. I mean, and crypto is essentially the same play. Oh, the world is going to go to shit, and I'm going to have this asset that is a store of value, as opposed to owning stocks or bonds or anything else. And there is some reason to think that gold has some of that quality. There's none to believe that crypto has any of that quality. And, as far as people thinking, well, the dollar is about to fade, or, we're not going to be the world's reserve currency, that to me is also nonsense.
Yeah. So what is kind of your thoughts about, given all of this and given the direction I mean, what do you think people, should be trying to do right now? Like, should they be trying to build community networks? Should they be like, are you talking about regenerative models and so on? I mean, should we be opting out? Should we be deplugging? Should we be building kind of open source versions of the tools? I mean, like Blue Sky, people are talking about now as a kind of antidote
Well,
to Twitter and so on.
first thing we need is some kind of cultural renaissance. I mean, I think part of the reason that people feel so alienated, you know, the Democrats were confused, right? They were looking at the charts and they said, look, inflation is coming down, the economy is doing pretty well, unemployment is very low. Why are people so angry? And the point was that their cultural diet was one of anger, distrust, cynicism. It was almost equivalent of film noir in the 50s.
Yeah.
And my take on that is if you think about what your TV diet has been since 9/11, The Sopranos, Breaking Bad, Mad Men, Succession, all this stuff, is all these terrible people screaming for power. And if you were playing a lot of video games, it's Call of Duty or, you know, these first person shooter games. And if you were listening to gangster rap, it was the same nonsense. And it was all nihilistic. And I think it actually affected people's mindset that they thought, well, if that's the way the world works, why not have a gangster like Trump be president? Because it's just a power struggle. That's all the world is. And so I think, you know, my feeling is that sometimes in times of very deep political repression, we get all of a sudden a cultural revolution that counters it. So my experience was obviously being a junior at Princeton in 1968 and having my two political heroes killed within 3 months of each other, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And it felt like the end of the world. It felt like, what the fuck? There is no point in being involved in politics. And so a lot of us just opted out and went into the music business or joined the rock and roll circus. What happened culturally from 68 to, say, 80, when Reagan came in, was the flourishing of American culture in a way that nobody ever saw. The music business literally doubled in size from 68 to 78, the total amount of revenue. The movie business was the greatest period of time in the movie business ever, whether it's the movies I made like Mean Streets or Badlands or The Godfather or, you name it, Chinatown, whatever. It was just extraordinary time of creative flourishing, even though Nixon was our president. So we just basically ignored him and we went on and some of it was political and oppositional. And, one can argue that The Godfather is a political movie, and one can argue that Chinatown is a political movie because it's about corruption and stuff. But they were thinking deep stuff. I don't see that right now. The general Marvel cinematic universe pop culture is not going to be something that we're going to look at in 100 years. I promise you. And as far as right-wing culture, I mean, who's going to care about Kid Rock in 20 years? Give me a break. You know, I once had a dinner that a friend sponsored me to come meet Andrew Breitbart. And he was railing about, we need our own Hollywood, the right wing Hollywood, and why don't we own a studio? Because there's plenty of money to be found and everything. And and I said to him, I said, that's the stupidest idea I heard in my life. You think Steven Spielberg is ever going to want to make right-wing movies? You know, I mean, give me a break. You have to
It is
start.
interesting though that I feel like right now, I just visited this thing in Miami called Hereticon, which was put on by Peter Thiel's Founders Fund, and there is a sense that the kind of like left-wingish kind of counterculture is kind of like out of juice, or like out of ideas, and there is kind of like the sort of far right or neo-reactionary movement has kind of co-opted the sort of rebellion, the sort of humor. Like the left doesn't really have humor anymore because everything is quite sanctimonious. You can't make fun of anybody because you're stepping on their identity or something. And yeah, also kind of like the sanctimony on the left, and also kind of even some of the diversity stuff. Like if you go to if I go to the Whitney Museum for the biennial, there's no like young white male straight artists can't
Right,
even get a show, but you have to be, from a depressed group and a
right,
different
right.
sexuality and so on.
Look,
So
I
it's
agree
like,
with all that.
yeah,
So
so
all that's true, but
yeah,
here's the problem. There's nothing from the right that is culturally inspiring. In other words, counterculture has to involve culture. So I have a very good friend who's a great critic. His name is Greil Marcus. And I posed this question. I said, where is the counterculture? Because my general sense was that everybody has sold out. You know, uh, you know, 15 years ago it was Public Enemy and Fight the Power, and now it's Snoop Dogg shilling for anybody who will pay him. He doesn't give a fuck what you're selling. He'll sell it for you. And so if it's true that the what we call the counterculture became the mainstream, then what is the counterculture? So Greil said to me, he said, well, John, you might want to consider that it's not, the left drug taking, whatever culture. He said it might be white nationalism. Maybe that's the
yeah,
counterculture.
that is the case.
And that's a scary thing. Now, my counter to him was, well, that's not culture. That's politics. That's counter politics, but it's not culture in the sense that there's nobody out there making fiction that's in that mode or making movies that's in that mode except these bad propaganda documentaries that Steve Bannon makes and stuff like that, or that, you know, the mule or all those things.
I mean, the fact is though, for young people, the way they're taking in media and the way they're being entertained is profoundly shifted, right? It's TikTok and Instagram. There isn't, there, I mean, there's some maybe subsets where novels are making a bit of a comeback, or but yeah, there's been a huge rearrangement to culture, and it's a moving target that it's like a different thing in a way.
Well, look, the mocking memes on TikTok of mocking the left, that may be very powerful. Um, but it's not going to pass, art is long, life is short. It's not going to pass the who
Yeah,
cares test.
yeah.
You It'll all be down the memory hole in 5 years. And what I'm hoping is, and I'm, in this new book, I'm writing about some kind of new shoots. There's this genre of music called Americana, and a woman named Rhiannon Giddens, who I've been spending time with in North Carolina, is
Yeah.
just making extraordinarily good music, but it's all rooted in the past. You know, I went up and visited a woman chef in Maine named Devin Finnegan, who has created a way to make organic food at a 2-star Michelin level, and she's taught the local oystermen how to do it better, how to talk to local scallop growers, how to do it in the Japanese style. And she's just this force of nature that's created amazing things. So I'm hopeful. I actually think that out of this thing is not necessarily going to be a political resistance, but a cultural shift that gets people to not feel so damn depressed all the time.
Yeah. I think all bets are off right now. We're all just kind of like, we're like strapping ourselves in, to
Yeah.
the plane. The plane is, torpedoing towards the mountain, and it'll be very interesting. But listen, I mean, maybe this is a, good place to sort of end for today. I'd
Okay.
love to stay in touch with you
Yeah.
and talk more, and maybe offline too. But yeah, I mean, I think we, sort of need to get more people. I mean, I'm really happy you wrote these books, and I think it's great. Like, completely agree with almost everything you said in them. But yeah, we have, the thing is that a lot of strategizing went in on the side of the baddies, like, or these people who've,
Yeah.
built these destructive structures. Whether you ever read the book Dark Money by Jane Mayer, which is about the
Yeah.
Heritage
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Coke. So they really sculpted this whole thing out. And unfortunately, I feel like there hasn't been on the other side as much of a strategic capacity. And I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. You know who's really making sense right now is Chris Murphy. He did a piece, an interview in New York Magazine for the
Okay.
Intelligence that is extraordinary. And just sort of how for Democrats to react to this situation. And he's the only guy who's making sense to me right now in the political sphere.
Yeah. Well, you must have felt that you kind of predicted all of this with the 2015 book.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I think I also saw the oligarchy coming, the
yeah,
new oligarchs,
yeah.
which, I'm pretty sure that Elon will stay in power, and it will affect all sorts of other people, because
Of
he
course, there's
holds
also the theory that Donald Trump is just going to get sick of him and send him
maybe,
off. Yeah.
maybe. But
Uh,
there's the other possibility that
yeah,
the Vance Teal
yeah.
axis asserts their power stronger, and
I
Trump
think it's more like
decides that he
yeah,
just wants to be on the golf course.
that is quite possible
He-
at this point.
He's more like a king than a president.
Yeah, totally. Okay, Jonathan, wish we had happier things to talk about today, but sometimes you gotta like
Yeah,
say what's
anytime,
up.
Dan.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Let's stay in touch. Great to meet you. Thank you for your
Okay,
time.
bye-bye.